You understand what it is that you have before you move it or do anything with it. And so that seems to me to be a rather strategic thing that an organization needs to make a conscious decision to do, whether that's getting out there with a number two pencil and a yellow legal pad and doing it the old way or hard way, or with any kind of technology or any kind of application to do that. But it starts with that strategic mindset. I don't know if that is something that is falling within, I mean, the capabilities exist. So what's the gap in that process there that we're missing?
There's a whole bunch of content in the enterprise that people shouldn't even know exists.
We're waiting for the industry to catch up to us.
You're talking about the empowerment of the individual over the empowerment of the establishment. So I'm joined today by Kevin Craine, and this is a rare opportunity for me to interview the interviewer. Kevin, the writer, producer, influencer, podcaster, host of the Digital Transformation Podcast, AIM on Air, Everyday MBA, the C-Suite Radio, and a host of other shows. We've had the good opportunity to meet in person in Dallas and have a few interviews since then digitally. It's great for you to join me again today, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me today.
Awesome. So we've seen some changes in the industry. Where do you think we should start?
Well, I know we've both been looking at the Gartner Magic Quadrant report for content services. It was issued last November. Um, I have been away from the report, I must admit, for a couple of years. So it was interesting for me to revisit the report. And there indeed were some rather, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but there were some developments in the market that I found intriguing. The thing that jumped out to me as I was looking at the report was that it's a long established market. Many of the vendors have been offering in this space for over 20 years, and there are new players in there, but for the most part, it's a rather established market. And I think what we're seeing reflected in the Magic Quadrant here is that many of the core capabilities have become perceived as commodity features. With perhaps a little differentiation. And I think we're seeing that sort of reflected here in the report. Gartner certainly mentions it. They're pointing to the integration of services as really the differentiator that is presenting itself in the market now, of course, along with the increased demand for cloud. But to me, there were some interesting positioning with some of the folks that we know. For example, IBM. Now, I have the great pleasure, have in the past worked with IBM. I know many of the folks over there, as I'm sure you do, Jason, and they're great folks. They have great technology. But one of the things that I noticed, perhaps wasn't a surprise, is that IBM had a rather precipitous drop. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but certainly they are suffering from what I think, and Gartner mentions it, kind of a diluted sort of vision about who they are in content services. Over the past 4 years, I know I've noticed IBM has either rebundled or rebranded itself 3 different times. So I think that we're starting to see that be reflected, and it has been happening for the last couple of years. But according to the report, Gartner clients don't really see Cloud Pak or FileNet as strategic platforms. I thought that was an interesting note, and are evaluating other solutions. I don't know where you come in on that, Jason, but for me, it definitely shows a rather precipitous drop for IBM. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave it to others to discuss. But it certainly is something that I think that IBM should be taking a good serious look at.
Yeah, there has been quite a few changes, and like in of course our friends and reseller over at OpenText as well as saw a rather steep decline in the rating in this. And I think it was a situation where uh, the acceptance in the market, kind of everybody took a step back, and the only one that was left out there was Microsoft,
Yeah.
because there's still people investing in Microsoft. Teams has proven itself to be pretty good, and as far as collaboration and OneDrive and that goes, it's very sticky and ubiquitous. So it's not necessarily solving the content services problem, but it's still selling, whereas the others, in my opinion, have had a decline because I think they kind of missed the market. It's, in a sense, yes, a lot of these pieces are commoditized in that everybody has business process management, everybody has customizability, everybody is web-based. Those things were very cool back in 1995 when organizations really started to gobble up this technology.
Mm.
But it's table stakes now, and there's lots of open source alternatives and others. But even those open source alternatives don't really solve the problem, because the problem is that there's hundreds of terabytes of data all over the place. So just having a new place to put it doesn't really solve the problem. And as we talked about
Well,
before, the judge is not saying, did you put it in a bucket? They're saying, did you know that content existed? Do you know how to find it? And are you managing it to the policy or to the law? And unfortunately, unless you have a greater understanding of your data, none of these, any of these technologies, any of them in the Magic Quadrant actually solve the, what are you doing about 90% of your data problem?
well, I know I've heard from many practitioners in information management and governance recently about a concern in their Microsoft environment, Microsoft 365 platform. We see Microsoft taking a rather commanding lead. I think there's some reasons for that. Certainly the integration that I think they're about. But you mentioned information. Is it within your information governance purview? And I think with the rocketing acceptance, adoption of Microsoft Teams, we're finding more and more practitioners really worrying about information that comes and goes and is created and shared within the Teams environment, within the SharePoint environment, kind of slipping through the cracks, and really worried about a similar sort of Teams information sprawl that we saw a few years back with SharePoint Teams sprawl or SharePoint information sprawl. Where do you come down on that? I mean, we see Microsoft taking a rather commanding lead. There are some reasons for that, but when it comes to information governance, you're saying that all of these providers are not hitting the mark. How so?
Well, to me, if I was setting up a wave or a Magic Quadrant, my threshold would not be, do you have this feature or do you have that feature? My threshold would be, can your organization reasonably expect to have nearly 100% knowledge of where your content is and what it is? Can people find that information through a semantic and automated search, ones that are actually driving connections between the data to make it more faceted and Google-like? Do you have a rolling records program, not a records project, but one that actually identifies records? If it's in Teams, that's great. It can still be a record. If it's a concluded contract signed by both parties that's sitting in a Teams site, that's a problem. If the records managers can't find it when it comes time to demonstrate that contract happened, either through litigation or renewal or whatever it is that's happening. So this whole idea of setting up a threshold for customer success should be the idea behind these industry analysts, and that's nowhere to be found. Like, obviously it is, it's saying, well, you need at least 20 million in revenue, or you need to have at least 100 customers, but that only means that you convinced a bunch of people to buy it. And I'm not saying this is as silly as pet rocks. There was millions of pet rocks sold and there wasn't a whole lot of value there. Obviously there's way more value, but it's not the measure of value. The measure of value is, can you find all of your information when you need it? Is it classified in a way that makes sense? And do you have to force somebody to change in order to find it and get the value? And nobody's looking at those important success metrics. All they're doing is saying, Kevin, do you have a business process management engine? And what database do you use? And if you check these boxes for features, then boom, you're in.
Well, okay. So you're talking about, and to me, two different things here. I mean, one is sort of the technical capabilities. Do we have capabilities to do this and so? And then there's the other, do we have the will to do it? Do we have the acumen to do it? Is it part of the way that we operate our organization? And that's almost more of a management or an executive, acumen and about how the organization conducts itself. So what are you really saying? That the Magic Quadrant is really not looking at what's important, or they're missing that important piece? And if so, how do they even evaluate that?
Yeah, so I was talking to Bob Larrabee the other day. I'm sure you know Bob from
Sure.
past member of the board at AIIM and the board member at Nuclear Information Records Management Association. And uh, some of the consensus that we found around this was we're never going to convince people to do work differently. So to have an executive say, I'm going to force all of my sales staff to do exactly this right thing with our sales thing, so that we make sure that CRM captures it. We've had 25 years of trying to do that. We know we're not going to get there. So it's not a leadership demanding something of their staff, because it's just too much. The approach that he's suggesting, and I agree with this, is what is the standardization by which people can start to realize the outcomes? What's the first thing that you need to do? And to me, the first question is totally different than what I see in these industry analysts. The first question should be, do I know what information I have? Before I decide what I'm going to do with it or how I'm going to do anything with it. And that's what my fundamental problem with the industry analysts is it starts off assuming that you know what you have, and it's just in the wrong place. And then once it's in the right place, you put some features on it. Whereas to me, it kind of misses the most important problem is, where's all your stuff? What is all your stuff? And how do you use that to inform your decision making?
Well, it's not unlike if you were moving from your apartment, you just bought a house, right? And you're moving from your apartment to your first house, right? It's unlikely that you're just going to take every single thing that you ever owned in your entire life, the St. Pauli girl neon sign and your futon from your dorm room and everything, and just pack it up into a van and just take it to your new place and dump it in there. And just, you're probably going to step back and go, well, or maybe your spouse or your girlfriend or whatever is saying, hey, the St. Pauli sign's got to go, Jason, right?
Totally,
so you make some decisions about what it is that you have, whether it's important or not, sentimental or not. Got to have it, don't care, throw it away, donate it, give it to somebody. And whether or not it's going to fit in your new house or fit with the decor or fit now your new life strategy of maybe, growing up and I don't know. You get my point, is that you understand what it is that you have before you move it or do anything with it. And so that seems to me to be a rather strategic thing that an organization needs to make a conscious decision to do, whether that's getting out there with a number 2 pencil and a yellow legal pad and doing it the old way or hard way, or with any kind of technology or any kind of application to do that. But it starts with that strategic mindset. I don't know if that is something that is falling within, the capabilities exist. So what's the gap in that process there that we're missing?
So the gap to me is that there's this vacuum between executing that first and the interests of the vendors who are the leaders in that space, because there is no standardization. So let's say, assume for a second that Bob Larrabee or me or whoever gets our way and say, okay, here's strategies for understanding all of your content first. Here's some good vendors out there. Shinydocs is included in those. And this is how you understand all your data. You got to do that first.
Yeah.
And it's not because I don't want to say anything bad about Microsoft or OpenText or IBM. Fabulous companies. We've partnered with all of them. We like them. They're good people who have powerful platforms well beyond the features and capabilities of most organizations need. But they are not creating an impulse for organizations to do that first necessary step. All they're doing is saying, skip to the end, put your stuff into us, and then we'll give you some value. But they're missing this massive step. And who's in the absence of standardization on how to take that first important step? That's where the vacuum happens. That's where people just kind of go, well, I guess I'm supposed to follow what the vendor told me to do. Let's start our migration that has an 83% chance of failing, says Gartner. And that's the great irony, is in one report, they say 83% of your migrations fail. And then the next report, they say, here is all the leaders in content services which necessitate you to migrate all of your data.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, it's by definition, there's only a 17% chance you're going to have success in this
Yeah,
industry unless you add this additional piece. And that's what I'm advocating for. I'm not trying to
yeah.
say anything bad about any vendors. I care for them deeply. I've built on top of their platforms. They're fantastic. I'm just saying that before you, we don't start at the finish line. You start at the start, and there's a lot of work to do beforehand.
I think what you just said is super important. It's not unlike I'm a process improvement coach, and it's often common to go start improving processes before you even know what the current process does. There's no measures in place to how long it takes, how many people, what its error rate is. We just know we want to change it. It's not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's enough, but how can you really move forward productively if you don't know what your baseline is? What you're saying is that is the same thing. And I think understanding what information you have, where it is, what importance it represents, what risk it represents, what costs it represents, is absolutely a critical baseline for moving forward with any sort of information management or digital transformation initiative, an absolutely essential piece. And so I completely hear what you're saying and agree with what you're saying there. I don't know why it is overlooked as a first functional step. It shouldn't be, and perhaps we'll see that changing now because we're no longer in the old norm, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think maybe what we're seeing a bit is with Microsoft's ascendance, perhaps, is that the the pandemic really brought about just an accelerated timeline and exacerbated what was already really going on in the enterprise all along. Workers want to get stuff done. They don't want to have to worry about information governance as it is where that needs to be transparent. It needs to be as easy as we are used to using our smartphone, right? And so monolithic approaches, I think maybe we're seeing that in the case of open text, where the complexity and perhaps the monolithic or the complexity of bringing all the pieces together, that's just an old normal kind of way of looking at it. So we're seeing a much more agile sort of environment. So where do you come down on that in terms of how we're seeing it reflected in the marketplace?
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels between content services and a lot of other markets out there. So, for example, well, let's look at connectivity as it relates to, do you do all of your information on-prem? Do you do cloud? Do you do hybrid? And then what does edge computing look like as well? So I was talking the other day to Duncan McGregor. He's the head of engineering at Terrago, a publicly traded telecommunications company. And he was talking about the 5G at the edge. So not talking about your cell phone. We always think of our cell phone when it comes to 5G, but he's saying, no. There's this nanometer wave technologies out there, crazy high bandwidth, which is not intended to talk to a cell tower, but it's just to go from the trailer that's at the bottom of the mining pit up to the station, which then translates it to the satellite or whatever. So you got this crazy high bandwidth that allows you to do a lot of edge computing cases. And then what do you do with that information? How much of it do you send over the wire? Do you send it to the cloud or to a managed service provider? And then what do you do? And these are complicated questions when you start, as we started riffing on this, we're like, okay, you got to make some decisions along the way. So my heart goes out to anybody who is a content services person or an IT person at an organization. They're like, it was so much easier when all I had to do was just take my file share and dump it into this other bucket. But now you're telling me I have to think about what workloads are happening at the edge and how much information needs to come across, what actually becomes a record, and what information I can dispose of at the edge before it even comes into our central repository. And they go, none of that makes any sense to me. There's no standardization. What am I supposed to do? And then people, when they're faced with not knowing how to change, they either do one of two things. They continue doing more of what they're doing, or they just stop doing what they're doing, saying, I'm going to wait, as opposed to taking a sidestep and saying, well, what are other industries doing? What are the new vendors saying? What's a different way of thinking about that? that's hard, and it's almost unfair, especially if it's IT running your records management practice. I'll throw out one more kind of name drop and anecdote, like talking to David McDermott, past president of ARMA. He likes to say the words like IT brings the tools and RM brings the rules. And he's softening up on that, saying, what I'm seeing lately is IT doesn't have tools for those decisions with respect to what comes from the edge. So when I'm saying the edge, is like, if I conclude the contract on here, but I have 10 other versions of the document, which one of those becomes a record? And how does it get into the other system? Maybe it's locked in Teams, maybe it's just stuck in a hard drive on a laptop somewhere.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of these workloads that just seem too hard in the absence of standardization, in the absence of bringing it all together, and it is too much. So we need organizations like big vendors to come in and say, don't worry, we're going to solve this problem for you. And I think that's kind of the nature of my complaint, why I might use mean words when I talk about some of the big Magic Quadrant leaders, because they are complacent. They're not willing to take on this new challenge, and they need vendors like myself. They need influencers like yourself to poke at these new ideas, because they need to get vetted out before an IT organization can just say, yep, that's the standard, that's how I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to feel confident about it.